Welcome back. It's very good to see all of you. I hope that you're having a good week. We discussed the exam on Friday, on Monday, and as you know, the review guide is available. I do encourage you to complete that. The exam, as a reminder, will consist of a combination of multiple choice and short answer. If you complete that review guide, you'll be in a good position to do well on the exam. And what I really encourage you to do is just try to be prepared to write on any of those individual topics or concepts. And in particular, I would encourage you to review the reading and be prepared to demonstrate knowledge of the reading. That's one of the best ways to do well on the exam, to kind of go above and beyond the material from the lectures themselves and show your knowledge of the reading. I trust that many of you have begun to prepare your review guides, and that you're well on the way to success on that test. So we'll take that on Friday. Reach out to me if you have any questions. I also have office hours today. Just one more comment here. We will take the exam during the lecture time on Friday. I'll be posting it on CAT courses probably a few minutes before the class begins. My custom is to give you a little bit of extra time because technically if you show up a little bit early to class, you can begin the exam. But it'll be posted on CAT courses and you'll submit it under assignments. It'll be posted under files. And you can also drop in to ask questions during the exam time as well. There'll be a drop-in link available, and you don't have to come, but if you want to, you can. As you know, we are discussing the courts, the judiciary, and this has us talking about the third of three authoritative institutions of democracy, the first two being executive and the legislature. Now, when you think about the relationships between these three authoritative institutions of democracy, we usually think about the separation of powers. And that's what's represented here. Now, you saw this on Monday, but I think it's worth looking at it again and just observing the sort of equality that exists kind of theoretically, conceptually, when it comes to the separation of powers. On the one hand, the legislature has the power to make and change law. The executive has the power to design and implement law. And the judiciary has the power to make judgments on law. And that involves interpreting and applying and sort of arbitrating the law. All of these authoritative institutions of democracy fall under the same constitutional framework. And in a democracy, the sort of understanding is that all of the institutions and players serve and answer to that constitution. They're all sort of bound by its rules and its restrictions and its restraints. And that constitution can be written, as in the case of the United States, or it can be unwritten, as in the case of England. But that constitutional framework is what creates the set of rules governing the different powers in the separation of powers. Last time we talked on Monday, a key question for us was, in the separation of powers, is there any space for the court to stand above the other institutions? Or are there any examples of other institutions standing above of these three? Or do any of these three stand above the other? And we concluded that maybe not, because they appear to share power and to separate power between them. Today, we're going to continue discussing the question of judicial review. And judicial review, remember, relates to the power of the court to review and potentially strike down or annul laws made by the legislature and the executive. And judicial review is a source of a lot of controversy. It's one of the biggest debates in judicial politics. The argument about whether judicial review is justifiable or not is a big argument. And the opponents argue that judicial review threatens parliamentary sovereignty. And this is the idea that the legislature and the legislature alone has the power to make law, and that it's the parliament who decides and makes law. It's not some other branch of government. And the sovereignty of parliament is its exclusive right to make law. That right shall not be infringed, is essentially the idea of parliamentary sovereignty. On the other hand, the supporters of judicial review say that, even though there's a separation of powers, the Constitution sets the standard against which all governmental acts must be assessed. And so that does justify a role for the court, the judiciary, in striking down or annulling laws made by the legislature. And that creates a basis for judicial review. This is a very interesting debate because this gets to questions about the roles and the responsibilities of the different branches of government. It gets to questions about the precise separation of powers, the distribution of power in a formal sense as well as in an informal sense. And it brings about questions related to parliamentary sovereignty. And if we were to define that, we would define it as follows: the right to make or unmake any law, and the fact that no body has the right to override or set aside the laws of the legislature. Now, this is the way that parliamentary sovereignty was envisioned and sort of written into the English Constitution, which is unwritten, but nevertheless, this is the notion of parliamentary sovereignty or parliamentary supremacy. And so the key question is, does judicial review undermine parliamentary sovereignty? Does judicial review threaten and thwart the legislature's right to make or unmake law? And if it does, where does that leave us? And how does that impact democracy? Does that undermine democracy? From the perspective of our discussion of the powers of the legislative branch, maybe it does. From the perspective of the constitutionality of governmental acts, maybe it doesn't. It all depends on where we stand regarding the precise role or function of the judiciary. And these are questions that remain unresolved. Now, I want to actually begin to incorporate you by launching a poll and getting your pulse on a very, very interesting and important question. And that question is, true or false, the framers wrote the US Constitution so as to provide the Supreme Court with the power of judicial review? I'm going to launch this poll and I want to see what you think. Still got a few votes out. Very interesting results. All right, I'm ending it. I'm sharing the results. As you can see, 23 of you, or 55% of those who voted, said it is true that the framers wrote the US Constitution so as to provide the Supreme Court with the power of judicial review. 19 of you, or 45% of those of you who voted, said false. Now, this is neat because it gives us a chance to kind of litigate this and arbitrate the difference or talk about the different reasons why people might have put true or false. So just get us started. Does someone want to say or talk a little bit about why they put true? Go ahead, Jeffrey.
So basically, my argument would be, well, first of all, even though many people argue on the other side, and I do acknowledge the fact, sorry, the people talking in the background, that's my mom. But anyways, I got sidetracked. Basically, what I was trying to say was that, like, fair game that, people who would mention that, oh, judicial review is not explicitly in the Constitution, touche. But I would say specifically that the framers basically set a specific structure of the government that there would be checks and balances. And if you actually read the Federalist Papers, the framers knew that judicial review was such a powerful tool, and especially because the Federalist Papers, which was supposed to help ratify the U.S. Constitution, because they needed a ratification, and so they basically knew that it was a powerful tool for the U.S. Supreme Court, because without it, it's basically a weak branch of the government. It will be like the weakest of the weakest. But even though it's not written specifically in the U.S. Constitution, it is specifically a powerful tool that the framers did know that it would be very helpful for the court to use. And I would say it would not be fair to basically say that they did not dare to mention it, because they were also running out of time. Because people have to remember that the framers were being time constrained when writing the U.S. Constitution, and so and a lot of people did not basically, not everyone voted unanimously even on the U.S. Constitution. So I don't know if that would be one reason why they did not mention the judicial review specifically in the U.S. Constitution, but it would say that many did argue that it should have been in there. But the argument also goes that many things are also left out of the U.S. Constitution that should have been in there, just like judicial review.
Just a few comments. So if it was so if it was so important, why was it one thing that they didn't include? If they were strapped for time, you'd think that if it was so important, it would be part of the actual Constitution, right? If it was that important, right? But I think that the question of whether it's implied is interesting. And you say that it's sort of implicit that they have to have that power for the checks and balances to really work, because without that power, where's the check and balance when it comes to the judiciary? That's an interesting point, and I wonder if that's a thread that we could pull and talk more about. I think that you're correct to identify the nuance and in the sort of idiosyncrasies of the whole thing. Efren's got his hand up, and I'd like to hear from him. What's up, Efren? Efren, do you want to talk?
Yeah, sorry, for some reason my computer glitched. But yeah, I put no that the framers did not write the U.S. Constitution to provide like the power of judicial reviews in the Constitution under Article 3. It has no mention of the judicial review. It only talks briefly about its like roles, such as just interaction with Congress, and also like what type of cases must be heard and how it must interact with federal courts. But however, needless to say, later on in what was the case, Marbury versus Madison, the judicial power was declared there, so it can be said like even though the framers did not have no intention or did not foresee any like judicial review, it was later established, so it can say that I don't know how to put it, but it's like the principles of like declaring legislative and actually like, I don't know. It's like it's hard to put it into words, but it's like the framers did not foresee, but it was later established.
But who established it?
The U.S. Supreme Court under the Marbury versus Madison case.
So why is that an important detail? Why is it important that it was the Supreme Court itself who essentially gave itself that power? That seems relevant, right?
Oh, you're asking me, or
Or I just sort of in general for
Oh.
anyone who wants to comment, because I think that it's interesting that that the framers, they didn't actually write it into the Constitution, but it was eventually set up. So it seems like it was bound to happen. But it was the Supreme Court who gave itself that power. And so it sort of begs the question, if it was bound to happen based on the pathway that was set up by the framers, or if that was precisely the kind of centralization of power that they were concerned about when they didn't write into the Constitution judicial review. These are questions that I just want us to think about, because remember that the institutions of democracy, these are choices that societies make, right? They make choices about what types of institutions to set up and how to distribute power between them. And so it becomes quite important who made those choices, right? And so, as many of you have pointed out in direct messages to me, judicial review is not in the US Constitution. It's mentioned nowhere. And in fact, it wasn't until 1803 in Marbury versus Madison that judicial review was sort of established or instituted as a practice in case law. And this is important because it suggests that from the beginning, the court wasn't given this power, perhaps because of the potential for the abuse of power or because of how it might affect democratic politics. Remember that they were very concerned about concentrating power in the hands of any actor, and they were chiefly concerned about, well, a crown or a monarch or a dictator, but they generally were concerned about concentrating power in the hands of any single body or any single actor. And so it may not surprise you then that judicial review was not part of the founding of the US constitutional republic. It wasn't a principle or a tenet of the system. It was, of course, something that came about later, but when it did come about, it was a power that the Supreme Court gave itself through Marbury versus Madison. And this itself is a very interesting question because it brings up questions about, well, the expansion of the powers of the court, the judiciary, and how that might affect politics, and how this becomes political, and how the institutions of democracy change through the expansion of judicial power. Because the expansion of judicial power isn't just the expansion of judicial power, it's also the contraction of executive or legislative power, because we're talking about the distribution of power and the division of power and the separation of powers. In effect, we're thinking in terms of a zero-sum distribution of power between these different branches of democratic government, the executive, legislature, and in the judiciary. So let's watch some videos that begin to discuss these questions in a more studied way. And they talk about judicial review and judicial power and judicial supremacy and how there is or is not a basis for it in constitutional law, but how on a conceptual and a theoretical level it works and how it can expand the power of the court relative to the other branches.
The term judicial review is nowhere in the Constitution, and it isn't really to be found at the founding. In fact, the term judicial review doesn't come into common usage until the 20th century. And it's about that time that Marbury versus Madison assumes its significance as a supposedly great constitutional case. There are many cases before Marbury in which the Supreme Court assumed that in a conflict between the higher law of the Constitution and a statute would be null and void if it conflicted with that higher law. Marbury versus Madison simply represents the first time it finally held that a federal statute did in fact exceed the powers of Congress and therefore was unconstitutional and void. It was simply the first occasion on which that power was used. It was not the first time that power had been recognized by the Supreme Court. Marbury has sometimes been used to justify what's called judicial supremacy, and that's the idea that the Supreme Court is somehow above all the other branches of government when it interprets the Constitution. When in fact, what the judicial power is the power to decide cases and controversies that come before the court. When a case comes before the court, and a conflict exists between the Constitution and, let's say, a statute, the Supreme Court has no choice but to follow the higher law of the Constitution. That is its duty to follow the law. This does not mean that the Supreme Court's opinions in which they justify their outcomes, the decisions that they make, need to be followed by all the other branches of government as though they were a statute unto themselves. What needs to be respected is the judgments of the Supreme Court. When they finally decide a case, the rule of law requires that the other branches of government respect the judgments of the Supreme Court. But that's not the same thing as adhering to the opinions of the justices when they justify their judgments. The idea that Marbury versus Madison invented the power of judicial review came about in the 20th century when people were trying to delegitimate the power exercised by the Supreme Court to invalidate, at the time, progressive legislation.
So this video by a professor from Georgetown Law deals with some of those distinctions between different levels or the different tiers of law in how constitutional law rises above other levels. And in particular, this professor talks about how the court has a responsibility to defer to the Constitution in arbitrating conflicts between different tiers of law. That doesn't mean, however, that the court's opinion is itself superior to the opinions of other branches regarding the interpretation of the Constitution. Now, it's an important but small distinction, and it is an important question in this debate about judicial review and judicial supremacy, because again, we're dealing with questions about the distribution of power in a democracy and the relationships between the different branches. The question of judicial review is really sort of like a theater of conflict within this debate about the division of powers, because judicial review really implicates the power of the court as well as the legislature, because it does place the court above the legislature in effect. Let's talk and listen to a little bit more about how the framers view judicial power in the US case.
Article 3 of the Constitution takes one of the three categories, boxes of governmental power, the judicial power, and it vests it in the federal courts, judges who hold tenure during good behavior and have guarantees against diminishment in salary while in office. What is the judicial power? That turns out to be a surprisingly difficult question. If you go to the founding era and you start looking for sources describing what the judicial power is in crisp, clear terms, you will be sorely disappointed. I know this because I've tried. It's not out there. And once you reflect on it, it becomes clear why you weren't going to find that crisp, clear understanding of judicial power. Until just a few decades before the Constitution, the judicial power was not thought of as a separate box of power. It was part of the executive box of power. People who are fans of John Locke will remember that Locke identified three great heads of governmental power: the legislative power, the executive power. His third was not the judicial power. His third was the federative power, essentially power over foreign affairs, right? So as late as the 17th century, judicial power was just considered part of the executive power. The judges were agents of the crown. Not until middle of the 18th century that people really start thinking of judicial power as something distinctive. But that means that when Article 3 of the Constitution is ratified, there isn't a big, long, centuries-old tradition of understanding what the judicial power, as distinct from the executive power, or even as distinct from the legislative power, entails. And people today still argue about what sets of powers might be incidental to the central case deciding power that the courts have. So articulating exactly what the judicial power is not an easy task. It's easier, not easy, but easier to look at legislative power, executive power, and give at least a rough outline of what those look like, although drawing the line between them is not easy as well. Figuring out the line between, let's say, executive and judicial power may be the most difficult line that the Constitution asks us to draw. The thing to keep in mind is it does ask us to draw that line. The entire structure of the Constitution is built around legislative power here, executive power here, judicial power here. It assumes we're going to give it the old college try, and that at least in most cases, we'll be able to come up with something plausible as an answer.
So questions about judicial power and the efficacy or value or democratic merit of judicial review, these are questions about what is judicial power? What does it mean to exert judicial power? Does that mean the power to review and annul laws made by other branches of government? Does that mean limits on the use of judicial review? These are questions that remain unresolved, and these are questions that remain a part of the debate as a result. We're still debating what is judicial power, and not just in the United States. The question of judicial review is a question in essentially all democracies, and the new democracies of the third wave also exhibit varying patterns of judicial review. And to some degree, it's a global phenomenon. This is an interesting question for us on an analytical as well as a normative level. And we have a couple different theories about why judicial review has emerged as a common practice. What explains the emergence of judicial review? There are two different perspectives, two different theories about the emergence of judicial review. The first one emphasizes the proliferation of this rights ideology. And it's the idea that judicial review is really a product of the global diffusion of rights consciousness, this promotion of rights and liberties in this resulting increased demand for the protection of rights and liberties. The idea is this necessitated and caused the emergence of judicial review, this rights ideology. The second theory emphasizes institutions and interests, and it sees the emergence of judicial review as a result of the creation of judicial review as a solution to the problem of uncertainty in constitutional design. Basically, it's the idea that during democratic transitions, adopting judicial review provides the prospective electoral losers with insurance. If actors fear that they'll lose democratic elections, you can essentially purchase their support for democracy by providing insurance through the adoption of judicial review. You can view judicial review as a new mechanism for political action. As an institution, it provides insurance to those actors who feel like they might lose democratic elections. And that insurance comes from the sense that judicial review provides them with one more mechanism to influence politics if they lose elections. These are very, very different theories. The reason I've put them in different boxes is because they are mutually exclusive. They are incompatible ideas. The notion of a rights ideology that diffuses from one country to another, that's very different than the notion of the adoption of institutional mechanisms for protecting prospective losers. This is a difference between a logic of rights and liberties in a logic of calculation and co-optation. You're essentially using judicial review, you're adopting it so as to co-opt those who might otherwise stand in the way of democratization. Now, you'll notice, though, that these theories might not apply equally well to the US case. Because clearly, 1803 came well after the adoption of what was essentially, at the time, democracy in the US. It might be the case that a rights ideology does a better job of explaining the adoption of judicial review in 1803. Now, here in a moment, I'm going to ask you a series of questions that helps us to begin to think about these different theoretical perspectives and how we can categorize them and understand them here in our context, where we focus on institutions. Jeffrey says, I find it interesting that they only mention Locke. Montague believed in checks and balances within the three branches of government, legislative, executive, and judicial. Locke was not the only philosopher who impacted the establishment of the Constitution. To be sure, Jeffrey, I think that it's an important point. They may have mentioned Locke because as an educational video, they probably assumed that that would be the thinker that people knew the most about. And Montague was important to the rights discourse and the rights ideology as well. The first question I want to ask you is, what institutionalist approach does this theory, theory one, exemplify? If we are talking about a rights ideology and a sort of culture of rights as the cause of the emergence of judicial review as a practice, what institutionalist approach would that exemplify? What type of theory is that? Tell me in a personal message. No, so I'm asking, what type of new institutionalist approach do these theories exemplify? Remember at the beginning of the class, when we learned about political institutions, we learned that, and we read about 3 different approaches that fall under the new institutionalism. These are analytical approaches, and these are general categories of theories, judicial review is a political institution. And so these theories that I'm giving you fit with certain categories of new institutionalist theory. We discussed 3 of them. So the question I'm asking you is, what institutionalist approach does theory 1 exemplify if it focuses on a culture of rights or a rights ideology? So let me just clarify it. The 3 approaches are historical institutionalism, rational choice institutionalism, and sociological institutionalism. Those come from the March and Olson reading, and we discussed those and used those in the lecture on political institutions. So I'm asking, which institutionalist approach does theory 1 fall under? Good, Efren. Tell me in a private message. Global diffusion means like a snowball effect, like it's adopted in one place and there's sort of like a movement or a spread of the idea from place to place. Good, Samantha. Keep it coming, everybody. Is it sociological institutionalism, rational choice institutionalism, or historical institutionalism? Good, Kyrie. Good, Justin. Nina, I think that you should review those. I think you should review it as well, Jeffrey. Good, Jocelyn. Good, Efren. That's a good reason. Alika, I think you should review those 3 theories. Keep them coming, everybody. Kayana, I think you should review those 3. Michael, review them as well. Good, Karen. Jake, so I think that you should review those. Good, Lewis. Lewis M. Tyler, I think you should review those. So those of you who I've asked to review, and those of you who've commented, the answer to number 1 is sociological institutionalism. And the reason is because remember that sociological institutionalism says that institutions are adopted because they enhance social legitimacy and because they are sort of adopted or taken from some broader social field. And because they kind of are adopted in that way, they help to enhance the legitimacy or the validity of that social organization in the eyes of other countries or the larger international community. And so a rights ideology is all about those cultural, sociological scripts, right? That like logic of social appropriateness. When we say that judicial review is adopted in a country because of a rights ideology, what we're saying is that that country adopted a sort of mindset that was popularized abroad. And the dispersion of that mindset can be viewed as a sociological process. It's a cultural process. Now, number two, I want to ask you the same question. The question is, what approach does theory two exemplify? And remember that we have three of these. We have sociological institutionalism, rational choice institutionalism, and historical institutionalism. I'd like you to consider those three and then try to categorize theory two. Yeah, I think that that's pretty much on point, Lewis. M. To you too, Jake. I think so, Hope. I think so too, Jeffrey. Yeah, Tyler, I think so too. Jocelyn, I think so, definitely. Although I don't know if diffusion is a part, but I certainly think the first word that you put is on point. More or less, Hope, yeah, because you can kind of think of it like the actors are creating creating an institution that they can coordinate around, if that helps to make sense, that they can kind of use to facilitate an agreement of some kind or cooperation. And this is related then to democracy. Good, Kimberly. Good, Justin. That's a good point. I think so too. Good, Efren. I don't know what you mean reactionary, Hope. Yes, Alika. Yes, Kyrie. Good. Definitely. So as many of you are pointing out, if not all of you, is that number two is clearly rational choice institutionalism. How do we know that? Because rational choice institutionalism says institutions are adopted because they allow actors to facilitate cooperation and coordinate their behavior, right? They set them up so that they can work together towards something or so that they can bring about some functional outcome, right? This is essentially the idea. They set them up as coordination mechanisms. When we talk about setting up judicial review as a solution to the problem of uncertainty, that's a coordination mechanism, right? And specifically, it's a coordination mechanism that helps to facilitate democratization. You can think of it as basically a way of co-opting the potential prospective losers in persuading them or assuring them, ensuring them that they'll be fine under the new system because this mechanism will help to protect them or provide them with something that they couldn't get through the electoral process because they don't stand a good chance of winning the election. Now, you might be asking, well, what is it that helps to assure them that they'll be fine? Why is it that judicial review can function in this way to resolve uncertainty and facilitate cooperation? You know, why is it that judicial review can become political and can help to serve an interest in that regard? Well, it's because judicial review implies an important role for the court in politics, right? In particular, it means that the court, the judiciary, has the capacity to strike and annul laws created by other institutions. Well, who composes the court? And who's usually in charge of appointing those judges? Well, the people who have power, right? But the people who have power probably won't always have it. And so they become prospective losers. When you enter into an unknown, uncertain democratic era, the actors who believe that they might lose elections at some point are going to be the first ones skeptical and opposed to that new democratic regime in that democratic direction. Judicial review, therefore, becomes a mechanism for providing them the kinds of assurances that they need to believe that the democracy won't be too unfavorable for them and that they might be able to protect themselves despite eventually losing the election. This is very much a rational choice perspective. This is all about resolving a coordination problem, reducing uncertainty, providing assurances to potential losers, providing them with mechanisms necessary to get them over the hump, right? So that they can agree to a democratic settlement. This is the nature of a rational choice perspective. This is the essence of a rational choice perspective. This focus on calculation, calculated benefits, resolving uncertainty, facilitating cooperation. So we have a difference between a sociological, cultural perspective that emphasizes a logic of appropriateness and a rational choice perspective that emphasizes a logic of calculation, a logic of utility, a logic of function. But if you said that this also has elements of historical institutionalism, that would be true too. The reason is because the period of a democratic transition, or the period leading up to a democratic transition, that's a moment in time, right? That's a moment in a sequence of development, of institutional development. That's a temporal dynamic. And so if you said that this is both rational choice as well as historical institutionalism, there's some truth to that, because this is temporal and historical just as much as it's rational choice and functional. And the reason is because that emphasis on the democratic transition reveals the role of time and temporality. This is also what helps to separate historical institutionalism from both sociological and rational choice institutionalism, because only historical institutionalism emphasizes time and temporality and sequence in that way. The other two are essentially static theories, whereas historical institutionalism is much more focused on timing and sequence and temporal dynamics. You know, we arrive at two really, really important questions. And those questions are, how does judicial review change politics? And how does judicial review change the judiciary? And everything that you've seen so far and that we've discussed sheds light on each of these questions. And I'd like you to think in particular about how judicial review, investing the court with the power to strike down laws made by other institutions, it can lead to the politicization, or excuse me, the judicialization of politics. You risk creating activist judges who are able to govern from the bench despite never being elected and despite litigating decisions made by popularly elected institutions like the legislature. You also risk the politicization of the court itself, because every election becomes a referendum on the court. If politicians know that the court is heavily involved in deciding what lives or dies, legally speaking, well, they take an interest suddenly in exercising control over the composition of the court. They very likely have that interest regardless, but you're intensifying that interest when judicial review becomes a part of the political process and it becomes a regular part of doing business. So we risk both judicializing politics and politicizing the judiciary if judicial review is adopted so forcefully that it does allow the court to sort of stand above the other institutions. Now, these are questions that remain unsettled, and these debates continue. And I care as much about your input and your opinion and your viewpoint as I do the arguments that already exist on the two sides. Unfortunately, we don't have more time to discuss this today, but I'm persuaded that we have covered this adequately. And I've learned a lot from you, and I think that you understand this stuff pretty well. So we are essentially out of time, as always. And so I want to let you go and thank you for being here. I'll see you on Friday. Do reach out to me if you've got questions. I'll be available, of course, during office hours as well. But otherwise, we're ready to go for Friday, and we should be locked and loaded. Thank you.